in Australian federal politics, we're starting to see this very consistent and very funny trend emerging where whenever the Albanese government is in some sort of a spot of bother where public opinion could shift against it, that a certain part of the Liberal Party, or rather the broader coalition, swoops right in with one of the most ridiculously insane statements or actions ever and takes up all the spotlight once again. And I'm going to focus on one of those instances today. Over the last week or so, the federal government has been in a little bit of trouble. The first thing was in an astounding episode of competence from the opposition. The Liberal Party, the Liberal National Coalition, and working with the Greens, surprisingly, in the sitting days of Parliament, were able to apply immense pressure to the government on the issue of there being aged care backlogs. Essentially, the approval process for elderly Australians to get aged care packages at home has an immense backlog. We're talking upwards of tens of thousands of people waiting to get approved. And in this rare flash of competent opposition, the Liberal government was able to get the Albanese government to admit that over the last financial year, that more than 5,000 elderly Australians have died while on the waiting list for aged care support. And the government essentially had to buckle in response to all this attention it was getting in the media. The Albanese government had to admit, okay, we have a problem, we're going to step it up, and this is the new rollout that we will have for getting aged care packages to elderly Australians quicker, so there isn't this issue of Australians potentially dying at home because they can't get access to these packages. And then, of course, on top of that, there was the entire Dan Andrews in China fiasco, which, regardless of what you think, politically is terrible optics for the Labour Party. And it all just wrapped up in this pretty stumbly week for the Labour Party's image on a federal level. Admitting there was a backlog, that elderly people had been dying, a former very prominent member of the party, albeit on a state level, getting wrapped up in a ridiculous controversy. It wasn't a great week for Labor. So what way was there to get out of this? How could the government possibly not be the story of the day after buckling to opposition pressure and this international embarrassment? Well, let's ask Jacinta Nampijinpa Price her opinion on something. Now, Mrs. Nampijinpa Price made a very interesting statement when it came to her opinion on Indian migrants to Australia. You know this is going to be good. Now, first of all, this isn't anything new. Every decade or so, the right in Australia finds a different target group, if that makes sense. You probably remember how much gay panic there was on Sky News, and before that, Pauline Hanson's temper tantrum in Parliament in the 90s about the idea of the country being swamped by Asians. And at the moment, in discourse, there is certainly a bit of paranoia, specifically over the idea of Indian immigrants to Australia. So aware that in right-wing circles, Indian Australians are now the punching bag for right-wing politicians, right-wing think spaces, Jacinta Nampijinpa Price decided to say that it was her opinion that the reason that Indian immigration has trended up is because it is a potential benefit for the Labour Party that Indians move here, become citizens, because they are a voting bloc for the Australian Labour Party. So that's fucking bullshit. That is American political brain rot infesting the Australian political scene. There is no ethnic vote in Australia that exists as to what Jacinta Nampijinpa Price is trying to allude to. It's so fucking obvious that these liberal-minded people in Australia, that they spend so much time in right-wing think spaces online, it's so astoundingly clear, because This is such an American interpretation of politics that doesn't make any sense in Australia. Look, in the United States, politics is incredibly racialized. White people vote overwhelmingly Republican. In most cases, upwards of 90% of black voters vote for the Democratic Party. And it is also a traditional norm there that immigrants have a tendency to be more democratic in their voting. But you can't take that political reality and throw it at Australia as if it is fact. That just puts on display the single digit of your IQ. There is no equivalency in the Australian voting system, in our politics. It just doesn't exist. There is no specific racial or immigration style of voting for people here. In Australia, the defining characteristic that can predict how you're going to vote, which always has and probably always will, is your income. Regardless of where you've come from or if you've lived here your entire life for generations, people in Australia vote based on their income. Unless one party completely shits the bed, like what the Liberals did this time. Now, the interesting thing about the immigrant community in Australia is that normally, historically, there is actually very much an ability for the Liberal Party to make inroads there. We're talking about people that might move here for job opportunities who are more entrepreneurial minded, like the idea of lower taxes, but the Liberal Party, in its current incarnation, is not smart enough to take advantage of that. She's not even apologising for it. She's clarified that it was a mistake, but that she has nothing to apologise for. If you're a member of the Indian community in Australia and you were open to the idea of voting for the pro-business, lower taxes party, but then you see a member of the shadow cabinet making a statement that is essentially, you lot, you're imported to work for Labor. I know it. They're not going to be too open to voting for you. Even Susan Ley won't make her apologise, which gives you a sense of how little grasp she actually has on the party. I'm starting to wonder if they even care about winning again. Not Susan Ley, I'm sure she is desperate to become Prime Minister, but the Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price types in the party, the much more right-wing, the much more combative, do they want to be in government? Because statements like this about such a big and such a relatively important voter base of immigrant Australians, that's sort of attacking. It shows no political know-how whatsoever. And it's almost to the point where how long can we assign incompetence before we start thinking that there is just like active malice towards their own electoral chances? Because let's be honest, Senator Nampijinpa-Price is set up for life when she gets out of politics. She will be the best Sky News pundit that they have ever had, beyond a doubt. And there is clearly a lot of money to be made in the rage bait style content that comes out when there is a left-wing government in power. And I wonder, is that more appealing to certain parts of the Liberal Party than actually being in government? It's quite a haunting question, really. Are these people just grifters who use these ridiculous fucking talking points to ensure that they get heaps of money and a steady job after politics? Or the more horrifying reality, are these people really just this stupid?